Hey there, creatives. I am so excited that you continue to show up and listen to the show. I really appreciate the positive feedback that folks have shared recently in emails. And I'm grateful that you continue to listen. Several years ago, when I started this, I thought, who's going to want to hear me? Uh, Who's going to want to listen? Um, and there are still some days where I have that thought and then I go, no, there are people that are listening and they're giving feedback and they appreciate the conversations that are being had. And I just feel like we're in this day and age where it's such a gift to be able to use this type of media to educate the greater public about our work and how important it is and how different it is from maybe traditional talk therapy and talk about the magic that happens within the work that we do. And so today is another episode of the Voices from the Expressive Therapy Summit special series. And I think it is really a conversation about the magic that occurs within the therapy work. And I'm speaking with Hugh Marr, and he is a clinical psychologist and happens to be married to a very well-known art therapist, which I didn't realize until we started talking, which was really cool. But our conversation is going to be about archetypes and the role that they play in therapy, and specifically the role of story in therapy and our life. um, I was just hanging on every word of this conversation that I had with Hugh. Um, he just shares so much wisdom and it just flows so easily from him that you can tell, he has invested his life work in the art of psychotherapy and understanding our roots and history and how we've evolved. um, so without further ado, uh, I'll have you listen to our conversation.
The Creative Psychotherapist is the official podcast of the Creative Clinician's Corner, a practice building resource for creative psychotherapists. TCP Podcast is the cast for creative, expressive, and experiential focused psychotherapists curious to learn how to design, build, and scale a thriving private practice. Your host, Raina Lombardi, interviews successful therapists about the tools and strategies they have used to develop creative, focused practices. They also talk about the products, services, and side hustles they have developed using their knowledge and creativity to enhance their therapy practices, make a greater impact in their communities, and diversify their income streams. Welcome. Now here's your host, Raina Lombardi.
Thanks so much for listening to the Creative Psychotherapist Podcast. I'm your host, Raina Lombardi, and I'm very excited to welcome my next guest as part of this Voices from the Expressive Therapy Summit special series. His name is Hugh Marr. He is a PhD in clinical psychology and has a private practice of psychotherapy in the Washington, D.C. area. He consults to other professionals and healthcare agencies in the fields of psychotherapy and substance abuse. He's taught both substance abuse counseling and psychotherapy at area universities and has worked in all phases of community mental health, culminating in running a partial hospital program for clients with co-occurring disorders of substance abuse use and major mental illness. He is the author of A Clinician's Guide to Foundational Story Psychotherapy, Co-Changing Narratives, Co-Changing Lives, which was published by Routledge in 2020, and the co-author with Carol Pearson Ph.D. of the Pearson-Marr Archetype Indicator and of the books What Story Are You Living? And Introduction to Archetypes. His forthcoming workbook for a general audience, scheduled for publication in January 2023, will be titled Finding Your Story. Thank you for being here, Hugh.
Oh, you're so welcome. I'm delighted and good to meet you.
Yes, nice to meet you too. And kind of before we even started, we were realizing, hey, we there's a lot of commonalities here,
Exactly.
um, which is really cool.
Yes, yes, a lot of connections that we didn't realize.
Yeah. So I feel like the world of psychotherapists is small, especially when you start to really circle into those of us that specialize in the creative modalities.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
So let's start by just kind of talking about what pulled you into archetypal work, because it seems like that is really woven deeply into the way you practice.
Yes. Yes, it is indeed. Um, it goes back quite a ways because I had been interested in Carl Jung's work a long, long
Mhm.
time ago. Um, and and then in the 1980s, actually underwent a Jungian analysis. And
Mm.
and that was obviously very, very life changing for me. It was very important. Um, and meantime, I've explored a lot of other different therapy modalities. So it's I guess how I see things now is a blend, but there's always this Jungian thread
Mhm.
for me. And then I went back to graduate school to get my PhD, and I took a class in consulting with agencies, and that was a
Mm.
seminar. That was an advanced seminar. And what they did in the seminar was they had a list of agencies that needed various kinds of consultation, and they would supervise these doctoral students to go and be the consultants for different organizations and agencies.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah, yeah, it was a great, great class and good opportunity. And so you had some choice in what agency you went to, and I looked down the list, and one agency was called Mirastem. And I thought, wow, what an
Mm.
interesting name, because I've got some interest in ecology and biology, and I knew that the meristem is the cell at the end of a bud. That's the growing cell.
Mm.
And I thought, what a cool name.
Yeah.
So I said, I want to do this one, right? Well, it turned out it was an organization that at the time was run by Carol Pearson.
Okay.
And, and I didn't know that at the time. And of course, Carol had, had published and was in the process of publishing another book about archetypes. And she'd already published one, and was really expanding that. And she really wanted someone to work with her to figure out if there was a way to help people assess what archetypes were most influencing in their lives at any given time. And so that's where I came in and worked with her, and then turned that into a dissertation.
Oh, wow. That
And
sounds like rich work.
oh yeah, though I broke two promises to myself when I did that. Um, I I had gone back to graduate school, so I was older, And so my goal was to get out of graduate school. That was the goal
Right.
of getting in, right? Right. And so when it came to dissertations, I promised myself two things. I promised myself that I would never do an instrument design where you develop some instrument, because unlike any other dissertation, right, if you have negative results, you fail. You can't, that's it. If you do some other study and you get negative results, that's fine for a dissertation. You just show how this thing doesn't work out. You'll probably never get it published, but you'll get your degree, right?
Right.
Not so with an instrument. And also, if you develop an instrument, you don't just do one study on it. You've got to do reliability, you've got to do multiple validity studies, you've got to study the questions that you select. I mean, you're
Ugh.
really taking on, so that was not what I had planned, but it was what I did. Um, and
Isn't that funny how that happens sometimes?
isn't it? Isn't it? Though, clearly I got through it because it was something that really grabbed me, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And then Carol and I went on to write a couple of books together, and that the Pearson-Marr Archetype Indicator is now very much still active and revised over the years, and and really there's a lot of rich material around it on the website Storywell. So and
Mm.
that's from the publisher CAPT. So that's how I came to this work, and as Carol and I began working together, um, we wrote the book, What Story Are You Living? And it became evident to both of us that even kind of beyond archetypes or along with archetypes really also relate to various stories and various kinds of stories. And we both began kind of moving in that direction and that kind of broader narrative understanding of archetype.
Mm.
I don't know, maybe I should back up a little bit. I don't know how familiar your listeners are with the idea of archetype. Should I say anything about that?
That was going to be one of my next questions in case people aren't familiar and haven't been exposed to that idea and concept or Jung in general. So let's
Sure.
explore it.
Oh, sure, sure. So Carl Jung is a very famous Swiss psychiatrist. Um, he died, I think, in 1963. And he was, for much of his career, he was a contemporary of Freud
Mhm.
and was actually in Freud's inner circle. And Freud had selected him to kind of be the heir apparent to psychoanalysis. But he and Freud had a falling out uh, uh, because Jung really took issue with a lot of Freud's theories,
Mhm.
and he had his kind of own way of looking at things. So that made for quite a difference. But for Jung, he really Freud's idea of the unconscious was that there is this aspect, which is a major aspect in all of us, which is very impulsive and very aggressive and sexually oriented, and our culture, our way of usually being in the world is just a thin layer over this, this rage and sexuality and impulsivity, and this is kind of Freud's.
I wonder if that was influenced from his use of cocaine.
Well, it's interesting. Um, yeah. Uh, he saw cocaine. It's a little sidebar here, but he thought cocaine was going to be the cure for drug addiction.
Interesting.
And so he actually experimented on people that were addicted to morphine and gave them cocaine. And, at the time, people didn't understand that cocaine was as addictive or as dangerous as it is, right?
Yeah.
Coca-Cola comes from it, had cocaine in it originally,
Hmm.
right? So people, including Freud, didn't understand that. And he had a friend who had become addicted to opiates. And
Mm.
so Freud gave him a course of cocaine and he overdosed and died.
Oh, good God. I didn't
And
realize that.
yes. And so Freud then, you know, he understood then that that was not the cure to drug addiction and this was not a way to go, but it cost him a friend. And
Mhm.
um so I think while Freud did use cocaine himself,
Mhm.
um I don't know that his theory of the unconscious, I think, is more rooted in other things than in his cocaine use. Uh,
Just the
but
association of like the rage, the impulsiveness, right? There's
that's
like a
true.
lot of like similar symptoms of
Exactly.
somebody who has been under the influence of that
Right.
substance.
That's a really good point. And so I suspect it fit for Freud. I suspect it
Mhm.
fit with his ideas until he realized that it you know wasn't workable. But Freud and Jung were invited in, I think it was 1907, um, to Clark University here in America to do a conference. And go ahead.
I don't
You,
know
you,
if you can hear the roaring thunder that's happening. I'm hoping that maybe it's being muffled out, but it's like a crazy thunderstorm. My desk was just shaking and everything.
oh my goodness. No, I can't hear it on this end.
Oh,
Uh,
perfect.
wow. Yeah, it's a lovely day here. So, yeah. Oh, wow. Yeah, I can't hear it. Well, hopefully the electricity will keep flowing.
I hope so too.
Yeah,
So they were invited to Clark.
sure, sure. And in fact, it was a time when there were so many people that were changing psychotherapy and psychology, and every one of them were invited to Clark. They didn't all come, but they all were invited, and Freud and Jung were among them. So they get on a steamship, right? They can't get on an airplane. They have to take a steamship from Europe to America. And so they travel together. And on this steamship, to pass the time, it's a couple of weeks. What do? They interpret each other's dreams. And Freud never wanted any of his dreams revealed. And Jung kept his confidence and never revealed them.
Wow.
But Jung revealed a dream that he told Freud and Freud's interpretation of it. Right. And in the dream, Jung is going into a house and it's a lovely kind of ornate house. And then he notices that there's steps that go down. So he takes the steps down and he comes to this like medieval castle with all of these armaments hanging on the walls and the symbol of the cross and all of this. And then he notices that there are some steps that go further down still.
Mm.
So he goes down those steps and he ends up in this Greco-Roman room that's decked out like the Colosseum or something, with all of the trappings. And in the middle of that, he sees a trap door. and he lifts up the trap door and he sees these stone steps that go down further. So he goes down these steps, and in the bottom is this cave with cave paintings and these bones at the end of the cave. Well, Freud's interpretation of the dream was the bones were actually the bones of Jung's father, and Jung, in an Oedipal conflict, wanted to kill his father and marry his mother. That was Freud's interpretation of the dream. Jung saw the dream as the layers of the unconscious, and that we're all connected, and we all have these different layers that go back in time and across cultures. Such a rich rather than a reduction
Right.
understanding, right?
Yeah.
And so that really presaged exactly how it was that they had this rift and broke up with each other. But you get the sense from Jung of just how we are, our consciousness is like just this little raft on a whole sea that goes back in time and goes across people all over the planet for a long, long time. And that's in fact how he saw it. And he believed that they are patterns in how our unconscious is organized, much like you know a snowflake is a crystallized drop of water, right? And
Yes.
when water crystallizes, it always assumes a six-sided shape, right? Now, each snowflake is different, but they all have six sides because that's the pattern of what water does. It crystallizes into six sides. So archetypes are kind of the pattern of our psyche. We're each different, but we each crystallize in a similar way, even though within that there are differences.
Yeah, I
Right.
love that.
So he came to it from he had an idea. If you ever watched old movies, when you're home with COVID or whatever, and you see some of these old melodramas, and they're doing this. They bring the person to the psychiatrist, and he's doing this word association test. Ham, and then the patient says eggs, and right.
Yes.
So actually, Jung really developed and extended that test. And he had a standard list of 100 words. And the whole first volume of his collected works is about that,
Wow.
about that word association test and his experiments on it. And what he found was that the way that people associated things, he realized there were clusters of ideas in our minds. Each cluster has a feeling tone, so it's connected to feelings, but it's a cluster of thoughts around the same thing. And we have a number of different clusters. And then he saw this patient he worked in a very famous mental institution, the Saltpeter Hospital. And he saw this patient, back then, you didn't go to the hospital, for 2 or 3 days in the psychiatric unit. You went for years, right? And your family could put you there on most any pretext. If you were just different or they were angry with you, you could be hospitalized. Well, this man had been hospitalized since he was a boy or an early adolescent. He never learned to read and write.
Oh, how
So,
sad.
yeah, and then he was put into this hospital, probably for some, who knows, acting out behavior or something. But they put him in there for the rest of his life. And Jung was working with him, and he asked the man to draw a picture. And what the man drew was a picture of a sun with a penis. Um, and Jung, because he was really interested in religion and mythology and had studied widely, he saw that what this man drew was an almost exact replica of an image that's used in this small Mithraic religion. It's like the man drew this symbol that
Mhm.
this religion, uses. And it occurred to Jung, we're all really the same, and unconsciously we are connected in
Yeah.
our symbols, and there's certain ways that we organize the world, that go across all of us, and those are the archetypes,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And so for Jung never said, well, there are certain things that are archetypes and certain things that aren't, and there's so many archetypes, and only so many. And he never did. That was not his turn of mind. But Carol Pearson, in studying Jung, realized that there are 12 archetypes that are especially relevant in the course of our lives.
Oh, interesting.
And those she identified and pulled out, and those are the ones that that really that we used in What Story Are You Living, and in the PMAI and so on. And they really are ones that are very big influences in our life stories.
Okay. And what might some
Right.
of those be?
So the 12 of them are the idealist, the
Mm.
realist, the caregiver, the warrior, the lover, the seeker, the creator, the revolutionary, the ruler, the sage, the magician, and the jester. So when you think about our life course, we all start in childhood as kind of an innocent idealist,
For sure.
right? And I have a 2.5-year-old grandson now, and the world is so exciting.
Yeah.
Uh, and I can take him down, and we can stand on a street corner, and he'll go, dump truck, dump truck, dump truck, right? It's so it's so exciting. Um, and so that's kind of the basis of the idealist, who for whom the world is, it's all going to work out, and it's all just fine. And then there's the realist, because every idealist comes upon something important in their lives that is an existential blow,
Oh,
and
yeah.
shows them the world is not all rainbows and roses, in fact. And some people, of course, encounter that much earlier than others.
Mhm.
Some encounter that almost from the beginning, right? And then as a child, um, we're best raised by people or by someone who is really a caregiver and has our best interest at heart.
Absolutely.
And as children grow older, they often become caregivers themselves. Um, Hopefully not until at least early adulthood. There's certainly the problem of people who are called on to parent their parents.
Oh, yes.
Right. That's a different kind of thing. But then also, as we make our way in the world, we have to take a stand about things. We also have to be able to plan and follow through with things. Um, and we have to be able to stand up for what's important to us, and that's the energy of the warrior.
Oh, yeah.
And we especially, of course, have to do that in as we make our way in early adulthood. And then we also, for most of us, look to find a life partner.
Mhm.
Um, and that's an example of the energy of the lover, but it doesn't have to be, energy in a love relationship. It can be the energy that someone has, or the passion in doing something that they love, or in
Sure.
raising horses, or in playing the saxophone, or
Mhm.
whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
um, but it's that that energy that comes from connecting with something else. It's different than the caregiver, because for the caregiver, um, you are you are caring and loving something that is not an equal, or someone that's not an equal, right? For the lover,
Oh, yeah. That makes
right,
sense.
it's more of an equality there.
Mhm.
Um, and then there's often, we're often pulled to look for, what is, uh, what is either this ideal in the world, or this, the part of the world that, when we realize that, you know where we are and how we live is not all that we hope it would be. You can get the idea that the grass is greener on the other side.
Oh,
And so
sure.
very, very often we go off on the other side. And sometimes that takes the form of a spiritual quest, like the Grail quest. Um, you're looking for this unattainable, Grail, that really, symbolizes the unification and the purity in the
Mm.
world. But the seeker is the archetype that, um, they're always looking beyond, and often moving beyond, and wherever they are is not quite quite right. And then there's, of course, the energy of the creator. Um, and when we're really in that, you're an art therapist, so you have an art.
Mhm.
I don't know what art yours is. Um, for me, I've found, though I love and play music, that I'm not creative with it. I came to that late in life, but I found writing, for me,
Mm. Mhm.
um, is where my creator comes out. And when you're really involved in the art that moves you, the experience is often that you're not making it, you're not doing it. You're a
That's true.
vessel. You're the vessel
Mhm.
through which it expresses itself.
Oh, yeah. And you hear people say that many times, different
Yes.
writers. Like I know, like Wayne Dyer, I think he had said that many times that he's not writing, it's being channeled through him. But
Yes.
many people talk about that process.
Exactly. 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 And of course, it extends to things like, the Beatles. The song "Yesterday" was in a dream. It occurred in a dream.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
Um, and just which is amazing to me, to wake up and have a song that's just there. But yeah, so it's the same thing. The revolutionary is, very often the status quo is, is damaging and even traumatic to many people. And there is an energy that's often needed to overturn the status quo.
Hmm.
We just heard about, the train strike that was just settled prior to, prior to a big walkout, which would have, stopped rail traffic in this country, and not just passenger rail, but freight rail.
Oh, wow.
We wouldn't. I mean, it was just settled. We wouldn't even have had the chlorine that cities use to purify drinking water if this strike had gone through. Right. And this is like yesterday. This was settled. And these rail workers, for years, the railroads have been cutting back on staff, and they've been, and they've
Mhm.
not given them leave time for families. It's been really difficult. And so many freight trains only have one staff member now. Um, and so if there's a problem and you have to stop the train and radio that you stop the train, if the problem is on some car, the train could be a mile long. If you're the only person, you could get out of the cab and have to walk a mile to find the problem. I mean, you can see how the revolutionary becomes sometimes very necessary to make changes.
Yeah.
Uh, and then as we get into middle age, um, it's not that any of these archetypes can influence us at any time, but they are times in our lives when they tend to be primary. And by middle age, we're all rulers of our kingdoms, and our kingdom
Mm.
may be, our house and our family, or it may be the company that we've started, or it may be our community of drummers or whatever.
Mhm.
We all have our kingdoms, and there are various ways that you can rule a kingdom, and some ways help the kingdom to thrive, and others really undermine it and make it difficult. So that's as you move into midlife, you more and more step up to the responsibility of ruling the kingdom that you have, and drawing on the wisdom, which is the sage,
Mm.
and that's an understanding of how things are and how they operate. And then the magician is a deep understanding of how so much of what's real is actually perception,
Mhm.
and to be able to understand and change one's perception. um, Anais Nin once said, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are."
Oh, yeah, it's such a great quote.
Yeah, and the magician understands that. Um, and then, finally, the jester, it's the ability to step a little bit away from life and see the irony in it and laugh at
Mhm.
it. And that helps us face so much of what would not be faceable,
Oh, yeah.
were we not able to step out and laugh. So those are the 12 archetypes um, that that Carol realized were really important. And then as she and I worked, we realized that each of these relates so much to story.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And for each of us, by the time we're in late adolescence, almost all of us develop a life story. Now, it doesn't happen much before that. It's interesting. But studies have shown in late adolescence, we develop a life story, and we not only tell parts of that story to friends and loved ones and so on, but we enact it. We live that story. And it's that life story of ours really determines, who we associate with, who we like, who we don't like, what capabilities we feel like we have, and what
Mhm.
we feel like we can't do, what our goals are, how we see the world, how we see other people, how we see ourselves. It's all through the lens of this life story, right?
Yeah.
And our life story is so influenced um, by the archetypes that are present and resonant, and the way that they are expressed in our own stories at a given time. Um, and of course, those stories are, we in just the course of a day, you have thousands of things that happen to you, that you see, that you discuss, just one day. None of us remember but a minuscule part of that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But the things we remember are the things that fit with our life story. It's
Mhm.
like our life story is the template through which we see the world. And we don't remember and we don't notice the things by and large that don't fit, or we change them enough so that they do fit. So we remember this conversation with our friend, but we don't remember it the way a friend did because we're looking at it through the lens of our story, not theirs.
Oh, absolutely. Right. That's why we can be in the same room at the same time with the same experience. All the same sensory information is happening. And what? That didn't happen. That didn't
Exactly.
happen.
Exactly. 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 And so these smaller incidents that we do remember, there's some of them that really both are determined by our life story, by the screen of our life story or the lens of our life story, but they also work in the other way. And some of the things that happen to us shape our life stories,
That's true.
right? So some of the occurrences that shape us, what shapes us really is what we take away from what happened.
Mm,
And of course, a really big um, aspect of that is traumatic occurrences. And trauma tends to, it's not too far to say it tends to distort our life story
that's accurate, I would say. Yeah.
and our remembrance of a traumatic event in the same way is itself distorted in a couple of ways, right? One of the
Mhm.
ways is that a traumatic event is like a nightmare. A nightmare is not just an anxious dream. Yes, it's an anxious dream, but there's another aspect to it. It's an anxious dream that has an incomplete ending.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
in the nightmare, you fall off the cliff and you wake up before you hit, right?
Mhm.
Don't really hit. And and that's the way it is with a traumatic experience. We don't have an ending to it. We feel like it just continues, and that's what keeps it recurring and keeps it going for us. And
Yeah.
also, at some point in what happens, we have to zone out to protect our deepest sense of ourself. We go offline. We go offline.
Yeah.
And that means we miss pieces.
Information.
Exactly. So the story of any trauma has gaps in it.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
those gaps that we keep bumping up against, and it makes us kind of keep going back to it and back to it, and it has it repeating for us. And so a trauma is a broken story,
Mhm. Mhm.
that in turn shapes our life story.
This episode of the podcast is sponsored by my practice, Florida Art Therapy Services. And we provide art therapy services, mental health services, and high quality supervision for licensed folks in Florida, as well as for art therapy credentials. And we also provide uh, experiential based continuing education programming. And we provide that for licensed folks in the state of Florida, but also our continuing ed can be used to satisfy the requirements for the Art Therapy Credentials Board continuing education requirements. And we have a couple of courses that really focus on developing supervisory practice. One is a 12-hour Florida qualified supervisor training. It's a 2-day training, and we have a couple of options coming up this fall for folks. We're going to have an in-person, in-office training, which will be limited to 15 people on September 24th and 25th, 2022. And it's going to be awesome. We're going to be engaging in lots of really great experiential activities. I teach this class with Amy Strom, who's a licensed clinical social worker. And part of what we do is have you engage in creating a sand tray about your supervisory identity, and as our kind of culminating event at the end of day 2, which is always really fun. We haven't done it in person since pandemic hit, so we're really excited about that. We also have another Zoom training, also 2 days, and that's going to be October 15th and 16th, 2022. And we'll still engage in experiential activities, and we make plenty use of the breakout rooms and interactive group discussion and things. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, if you're a licensed therapist in the state of Florida, please go ahead and head over to our website, floridaarttherapyservices.com, and you can find that under the continuing education tab under 12-hour Florida qualified supervisor. And I haven't added the next date yet, but we will have a date coming up for a 6-hour supervision and art therapy training, which I hosted earlier this year, which was really wonderful. We go over theory, structure, applications, practical aspects, plus didactic and experiential based activities to really synthesize the learning that we're engaged in. And so we'll be adding another opportunity for that this fall. So if that's something that you're interested in, you can find that under the continuing education tab as well. And we have a couple of other trainings too coming up. So check that out and enjoy the rest of the podcast. Yeah. Yeah. So how do you go about helping people through the archetypes and through narrative to become the author of the story that they want to live rather than the one they've historically been enacting out and living?
Well said, because that's exactly the process of psychotherapy. It's really helping people turn a tragic story into a redemptive story.
Mm,
People come to us with tragedies, and our job is to help them redeem it
mm,
so that it changes the arc of their life story. And so all psychotherapies have to work with stories. The reason is we are storied creatures. We're not, we call ourselves Homo sapiens, and I think that's so narcissistic. We're not uh, wise hominids. You only have to look at, the wars and the coming ecological disaster, and to realize Homo sapiens is a real misnomer. What we really are is Homo narrans, right? We're really the storytelling creature.
Yeah.
right? And that started about roughly 60,000 years ago, right? I mean, we're not even the most successful hominid, right? We've only been around 330,000 years. Homo erectus was around for 2 million years,
Wow.
right? We're kind of a drop in the bucket, even compared to other hominids. Um, but we had I think, a really, really difficult situation, even more than other animals, in that we had to live in two worlds at the same time. One is the world of objects, and the other is the world of imagination.
Mhm.
We are forever caught between these two worlds as humans because we have this ability to imagine. Um, and both of those worlds are real,
Yeah.
right? And they influence each other, but they're not the same. And when we try to make them the same, we run into a lot of problems. Like when we try to make depression a dearth of serotonin, right? Depression is so much more than a dearth of a neurotransmitter.
Right.
So we often try to simplify things by defining one in terms of the other, but it doesn't work. We can't do that. And so about 60,000 years ago, humans developed a incredible tool to enable them to live in these two worlds. Um, and that was stories.
Mhm.
Stories combine the imaginative with the objective world.
Right.
So, right? And images, for example, are so powerful because they conjure stories for us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the metaphorical aspect of story and imagery, it helps people to make sense of their
Yes.
experience where they
Yes.
really feel it deeply in
Yeah,
a way that just talking about their experience, they don't.
exactly. Exactly. Because we think in stories, if you sit in a restaurant and you eavesdrop, what you'll hear is people telling each other stories, right? We talk in stories. We remember in stories. So,
Yes.
right, we are so immersed in stories. We're like fish immersed in water. We're immersed in stories. That's how we think. It's how we talk. It's how we remember. Um, and we tell our first story by the age of 3. And a 3-year-old can tell the difference between a story and a recipe. And of course, by the age of 3, you've already heard tens of thousands of stories.
Right. And you were really attentive listening in,
Yes.
right?
Yes. Yes, exactly, exactly. And your caregivers tell you stories, and you see stories on TV, and you read stories in your little books, and you're just you're surrounded with stories. And so that becomes, that's the lingua franca. That's the way that we operate
Mhm.
is through stories. And that enables us to connect the imagination with the world of objects, and then build a skyscraper, right? Or a cell phone that connects to a satellite.
Mhm.
That gives us so much. Um, so it's no wonder that we have a story of who we are,
Yeah.
have a life story. And And stories all have the same parts. They all have the same flow. Um, and uh, and they all are, they all have, for example, they have a setting. They take
Hmm.
place in some time, whether it's a galaxy far, far away, or whether it's just once upon a time, right? All
Yeah.
stories take place somewhere, and in some context. The setting is the context for the story. And there are certain roles that are in every story, right? So there's a protagonist or a hero,
Mhm.
or heroine, and there's an antagonist. Stories are about conflict.
Yeah.
Now, the antagonist, doesn't have to be Freddy Krueger. It can be, it can be some other person or person-like thing, but it also can be nature,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So stories like Hemingway's The Old Man in the Sea, right? And this guy goes out in this boat and he catches this fish, and then the sharks start eating it, and he's trying to make it back. And, um, yeah, it's man versus nature, right? Nature is the antagonist in that story. Um, it can be a society or an organization. Um, you know, um,
System.
yes, exactly, exactly. And the antagonists can be ourselves, and that's another. Um, and so, story is about conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist, and the protagonist has helpers. There may be other people involved with the antagonist too, but but often the protagonist will have helpers, and people that will either give her wisdom, or lend in some way um,
Some
some
kind of
help.
guide.
Either it can be some kind of guide, exactly, or it can be just somebody who will um, who stick with you, like a companion of Bilbo Baggins, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, who will be with you as you undergo the journey. And stories have a plot, and that plot has a particular arc to it. Um, and that story arc, from rising action to climax or midpoint to falling action to ending, um, actually was first identified in the late 1800s, um, with a review of Shakespeare's tragedies and early Greek tragedies, and they all had the same arc. And it's the same arc throughout myths
Hmm.
from all over the world, right? The plots have the same arc to them. Um, and 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 the roles in the story are filled with characters play the roles. So we each we bring to a story, we flesh it out with the character who plays the role. um, and stories also have, which often people don't recognize, every story has a witness. There is no
Mm.
story without a witness. Even if the witness is yourself, even if you're witnessing a story that you're telling yourself, if you're telling yourself a story about how your boss has it in for you, and you really shouldn't be working there anyway. So he's the antagonist, and you're the hero. Um, of course, if you tell your coworker, the coworker is the witness. But if you just repeat this to yourself, then you also play the part of the witness. And as therapists, one of the major things that we do is to witness
Yeah.
people's stories, right?
So true.
Um, yeah. And that is in itself so healing. It helps people step somewhat out of their stories, at the same time validating them for who they are. Um,
Yeah.
and that
That's
witnessing, that's the basis
so
of
important.
psychotherapy. Yes.
It's an integral. I do a lot of work with teens. I do some groups at the Children's Crisis Hospital
Ah,
and in town. Like I have a contract with them. I've been doing that for a really long time, like 8 years. And so the one thing, like they will say it over and over and over again, is this I don't feel understood. My parents don't listen to me. They don't,
yes.
they, they just want to be seen, to be seen for who they are in that moment without somebody having this huge emotional reaction and predicting their the terminality of their life as a result of the choices that they're making in this
That's right.
moment.
Yes, yes, that is so, so true. And it validates them as a person. And when people don't listen, then it invalidates them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they feel it so acutely. And it severs relationships with teachers and parents and coaches and whatever when their stories are not witnessed.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, and that's the basis of the therapeutic relationship, and that's what underlies all of therapy. We're, besides being storied animals, we are connected. We're group
Yeah.
animals.
Yeah.
And so being able to tell your story to someone else is so important and so powerful. Um, and so that's the underlying basis. And for some clients, I think in general, the more problems someone has, the more difficulties and disturbances they bring, the more important that witnessing and that relationship is. It's important with everyone who seeks therapy, but
Hmm.
the more damage a person has encountered, um, the greater the importance.
Yeah.
With people who've encountered less damage, then the particular approaches and techniques that you bring become more important. Though the witnessing is still the basis, is still it's kind of the rock bottom. Um,
Gosh, it's so I wish that like new clinicians really could hear that, that what you said is so true. And I feel like there at the sense when people are just coming into the field that they like want to impart all these skills to the client so the client can move through what they need to move through. But that's too fast. The client has to go at their pace, and that first part is just that coexisting in the space together.
right. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
It's,
Yes. We live in relationship to others. Even the hermit who lives by himself off in the woods. When he thinks about things, it has people in it. right? He has people in his head, as we all do. He just has fewer people in the outside world. So
Mm,
we change in relationship to others. And so that psychotherapeutic relationship, that's the backbone of what we do. It's not it's not some technique, it's not some wisdom that we impart to the client.
mhm,
Yes, sometimes we impart wisdom. Yes, sometimes we have a person um, uh, do something that leads them to a different kind of insight. Um, but it comes out of that they have a safe connection with us and they know that we are truly witnessing the story of their lives.
mm.
And then it can come out. So every therapy, you know, clients tell about 4.1 stories in each session. At least that's the research. Um, of course, many clients tell more. It just depends. Um, and so every therapy has to have a way of dealing and utilizing with stories, and each therapeutic modality emphasizes a different part of story without often recognizing that that's what they're doing, right?
Sure.
So, the things like the more humanistic therapies, well, they really emphasize that relationship.
Mhm.
Now, they may not think of it as witnessing. It is, but it's that relationship. That's what they may emphasize. Um, More cognitive therapies really help the protagonists plan their way through the arc of the story, plan their way through the plot. So to figure out how to work things that way. Um, other therapies, Jeffrey Young, with looking at the kind of the themes that come up in therapy. That's looking at the theme of the story and helping a person change the theme in their
Mm,
life story. So, each therapy emphasizes,
mm.
one part more than others, and but they all of our therapies work with story. Some of the bodily therapies, stories relate to, we feel our stories in our bones,
Yes.
right?
Yes, in our body,
That's right.
absolutely.
That's right. That's right. And changing that bodily um, sense, that sensory underlying aspect to our story is what a lot of bodily therapies do. So each therapy works with a different part of story. Um, and so if you have a view of psychotherapy as about story, then that lets you integrate any number of approaches,
Mm,
right? Because you realize they each have a place in helping a person turn a tragic story into a redemptive one.
I I am, like, blown away by how you've woven each part together to pull it into that I've never thought about each therapy as working in that capacity, but after hearing how you've laid everything out, it completely makes sense.
Ah, yeah, yeah. Well, we are story creatures, and so of course, and the way that change occurs in stories. Um, it comes through conflict, um, and it's what's a word? Um, it's a dynamic way of changing where we come up against something that we see as an impediment or is different, and it's in that struggling with it um, that we come out different. Right? And that's dialectical. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a
Oh, yeah.
dialectical process, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Uh, yeah. Um, so and so that dialectical way of changing, because it's built into stories, it's built into us. And so when we confront the things in life that are hardest for us, it's that confrontation that lets us change.
Yeah.
And then, of course, to be ready for the next conflict and the next change.
It never really stops.
No, it's a spiral. Yes, yes, yes. It's a spiral.
Mhm. I feel like, we didn't talk too much about like business and entrepreneurship as therapists, but it all mirrors that same process. We're butting up against our old stories when
Right.
we're, expanding and putting out a new way of being in the
Yes.
world. And we're having to
Yes.
rewrite like what that means to speak on a podcast, maybe, or what that means to promote yourself, which for many
Yes.
people that feels incredibly uncomfortable.
Yes.
Even though if you don't, people aren't going to know that you're available to help them. Like we
That's
have
right.
to do it.
That's right. That's exactly right. Um, and um, the protagonist in every story has an intention or a wish,
Mm,
and that helps get the story in motion. There's some goal, may not be a specific goal, but it's an intention or it's a wish, or there's some dissatisfaction that provides the energy to get the story moving to begin with. And so, very often, when people want to expand what they're doing, you know, for them to think about, so what's my intention
mm,
here, and why now? Why do I want to change things now? And that speaks to a part of story, the calling.
mhm.
Um, and it's a pull, which we usually, our first response is usually to resist it and to deny it,
Yes.
right? But eventually it rattles hard enough that we realize we're going to have to do something different. That gets scary.
Yeah.
um, but um, we either proceed and that becomes the story, or we surrender.
Mm,
We don't go forward. And that's a very different kind of often tragic story where
yeah.
we become caught and locked in the status quo. Um, and then we don't fit with the times, and we don't fit with what we need. And we end up very unsatisfied.
Yeah.
Um, so for people, I would think to think about, where do you want to go with your practice, and what's pulling you there? What's come into your life now that says, something needs to change?
Yeah, no, that's wonderful, wonderful words of wisdom, and great questions to think about. Um,
Hmm.
I all of the story parts, which you're I'm sure you probably connect to. It's like the Campbell's work, um,
Exactly.
the hero's
That's
journey.
exactly right. Exactly right. So he's, it was, the leaving,
Mhm.
um, and then there's the confrontation, um, and then there's the returning home.
Yeah.
So it was, and all story arcs have those three parts, just as Campbell's mythology did. And of course, Campbell divides it further into 17 little subparts, right,
Yeah.
that make that up. But it's basically a three-act play,
Mhm. Yeah.
um, which is um, that's what the German playwright Gustav Freytag, he's the one that first identified the arc of story, and that's what he said. It's all a three-act play. Um, even a five-act Shakespearean tragedy, um, it's five acts because that middle act is really
Two.
divided into three. Yeah, yeah, it's divided around a third act turning point. It's really, in essence, a three-act play.
Mm.
That's how stories work. That's the arc of a story. So, yeah, Campbell is a great example of that. And of course, he reviewed myths from all over the world, thousands of myths.
Yeah. I watched it was like a very, very old PBS series recording of him like talking about all of his work and everything. It was fascinating. Um,
Was it the interview with Campbell and famous reporter? He's
I
dead now.
yes, I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah. Oh,
probably what it was.
that's a wonderful introduction to Campbell and his work. And of course, Campbell was a Jungian.
That totally makes sense.
Yes.
Given how he thought about the roles of the different characters and the parts they were playing, even when you were describing the the 12 the archetypes that I was like, okay, relating to that too. Um,
Right.
it's that connection, right? That Jung was talking about, that like when you're looking back historically, it's all there and it's all here all at the same
Right.
time.
Exactly.
Um, yeah. So
Exactly.
for folks that would be interested in learning more, because I like you're just a wealth of knowledge. The information just flows from you with such ease
Uh,
and synthesis. For folks that would love to learn more from you, what is the workshop that you're going to be offering at the November online Expressive Therapy Summit?
sure, sure. So it will actually be on archetype and story. And I'll expand on much of what we've talked about today. Yeah, if I can do just a little plug, this is this is my
Oh,
book,
yes.
A Clinician's Guide to Foundational Story Psychotherapy. And I tried in that to write the therapy book that I wanted to read.
Mm,
That was my goal. So hopefully it'll be the book that many others will want to read too. But it helps you see psychotherapy and what we deal with through a storied lens. Um, and then it offers a lot of different ways to help people change within that. Um, so that's certainly another way. I have a workbook coming out in January, which I think you mentioned in the intro, and
yes.
that's going to be called Finding Your Story. And man, that's a workbook for a general audience. So certainly would fit for probably a lot of the clients of people, so that they can actually work through it and get a sense of what their own life story is, and then what of that story fits for them and what doesn't, and where to go from there. So,
Sounds
uh,
wonderful. Is that available pre-order at this point?
oh, that's a good point. The publisher is CAPT, CAPT,
Okay.
and people can go. They can either go to CAPT.org, or they can go to that Storywell website. And that's a really good question. I'm not sure, but
That's okay.
if it is, it would be on one of those. And then, of course, in January, it'll be available through, you know, Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and
All of that
all of
stuff.
it, all that stuff. Yes.
Well, what I will do is I will put links to your workshop at the summit in the show notes. I will put links to your publications that are already out in the show notes. So, your Foundational Story Psychotherapy book. And then you have a couple of others that are published by CAPT as well. What Story Are You Living? And the Introduction to Archetypes. So I'll put
Yes.
those on there too. And I'll put on there that Finding Your Story will be available on the CAPT website in January of 2023. And then hopefully at some point I try to go back and update check links, and we do like a periodic review and um of what's already in the show notes on the website, because links expire.
Exactly. Yes.
And we'll replace that with the actual link once it's available.
Oh, that's great. Wow. Thank you, Raina.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really I feel I feel really lucky, and I feel like this has been a gift for me because I've learned so much from you today, Hugh. So thank you.
Oh, oh, you're welcome. I so appreciate it. It's I spent a long time working in a lot of different psychotherapy settings, and I've been working throughout to try to understand, how does it all go together? So it's what I've come to at the end of my career after reflecting on all of this. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Well, it just I was hanging on every word, and I just really appreciated talking to you. And I'm sure whoever attends your session at the summit is going to walk away much richer for having attended. So thank you for sharing your wisdom with the rest of us.
Oh, well, thank you. And what a pleasure to meet with you and talk with you.
I hope that you guys enjoyed listening to this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it. As sometimes, like, I feel like it's a little bit unfair. Like, I get to be doing this, and I kind of have to pinch myself. Like, oh my gosh, did I really get to do that? And I don't know, this afternoon, recording this interview was like that for me. I felt like there were so many things that you said that really synthesized some learnings that I already had learned in the past, but just really kind of integrated and reinforced them in the worldview that I have about the work that we do. And gosh, I just found him a wealth of knowledge. And I could have let the interview go on for hours and hours because I was hanging on every word. He's just so knowledgeable. But the way he breaks down the concepts and talks about them, it just makes it so easy to understand and take in. And I loved the way he talked about um, how, you know, we're all kind of in a story throughout our lives, and we get to choose the story that we're living. We get to change it if we want, and that happens in our imagination. And when we can use our imagination, we can start to change our story and take ourselves in a different direction. Anyway, if you found this interview fascinating and with a desire to learn more, I highly recommend you checking out his session at the upcoming Expressive Therapy Summit, which will be on November 5th from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And it's going to be an archetypal and narrative approach to identifying and changing life stories. And you can do that by heading over to www.expressivetherapysummit.com. If you click on virtual summits and then click on the program, you'll be able to find the date and November 5th and go right it'll be easy to identify his particular session. But I definitely encourage you to peruse the entire program because there are always so many amazing, accomplished, knowledgeable professionals that are sharing their wisdom with the world at this event. And so, again, thanks so much for listening. And I will talk with you next week for another episode of the Voices from the Expressive Therapy Summit. And this one will be talking with Larissa Cresswell.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Creative Psychotherapist. If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. For show notes, downloads, and additional resources, head over to the website at www.creativeclinicianscorner.com.